Chapter 1. The Obsession Begins. Dr. Samantha Gray was never one to back down from a challenge. That's why, when she first heard about the cursed gold statue, she got fascinated with finding it. For years, she spent every waking hour researching its history, reading through ancient books and manuscripts in the hopes of uncovering any hint that might take her to it. Her coworkers thought she was insane, but she didn't care. She knew there was something unique about that statue, something that made it all worthwhile. Strange things began to happen as she looked more into the statue's past. She would hear whispering in the darkness, feel a chilly breath on the back of her neck, and see shadowy entities lurking in the corners of her vision. She first tried to dismiss these symptoms, blaming them on stress and a lack of sleep. Yet as the murmurs gathered louder and the shadows became more tangible, she began to question whether there was more to this monument than its terrible reputation. Despite the bizarre incidents, she never lost sight of her aim. She understood that the only way to remove the curse was to discover the statue, and she was determined to do so no matter what. Years passed, and her passion became stronger. She had almost given up when a breakthrough occurred. A new document had been uncovered, one that had been stored away for generations. Samantha looked over the book with newfound zeal, eventually uncovering the hints she had been looking for. The statue was claimed to be concealed deep in the bush, at a distant shrine that few had ever visited. Samantha collected a team of researchers and went off on an expedition to discover the monument, ignoring the warnings of those who knew of its curse. Little did she realize, the true danger had only just begun. Chapter 2. The First Sign of Trouble. Samantha and her team had been traveling for 2 days through the forest when they came to an old temple. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen, covered with vines and moss and cloaked in strange stillness. Samantha felt ominous as she neared the entryway, but she couldn't resist the allure of the relic that lay within. Samantha spotted unusual patterns inscribed onto the temple's walls as they walked through it. These were unlike anything she had ever seen, yet she knew they were significant. Her delight was tempered by a sensation of discomfort, as if they were being watched. They eventually made it to the inner room, where the statue was meant to reside. As they entered, however, they discovered that the room was empty. Samantha's heart dropped. Had they been beaten to it? They noticed a faint sound coming from above as they investigated the chamber. Samantha looked up and noticed a small hole in the ceiling, hardly large enough to allow a human through. "Someone has taken it," she whispered, hardly audible above a whisper. "We need to figure out who." They returned outside and followed a trail of footsteps that led away from the temple. Samantha knew they were near because the tracks were new. The suspense grew with each step as they followed the track further into the bush. Samantha noticed a tiny rustling sound behind her as they traveled through the deep vegetation. She turned around, grabbing automatically for her revolver. Yet there was nothing to be found. She attempted to dismiss it as nerves, but the sensation persisted. Something seemed to be following them. They eventually arrived in a clearing where they noticed a group of men huddled around a small fire. Samantha knew them as local thugs notorious for their ruthlessness. The monument stood in the midst of their camp. Samantha understood that they couldn't just walk in and grab it. They were outgunned and outnumbered. They needed a strategy. They withdrew to the safety of the trees, where they huddled together to plan their next move. "We have to grab that statue," Samantha replied quietly. "But we can't simply stroll in and grab it. We need to divert their attention in some way." A young man called Jack, one of her team members, spoke out. "I've got an idea," he said. "We could distract them by starting a fire on the other side of their camp. That would take their focus away from us." Samantha nodded, clearly impressed. "Excellent thought. We'll need an accelerant to get the fire started rapidly. Any suggestions?" They spent the next hour rummaging for resources before devising a strategy. They'd slip around the camp's perimeter and light a fire on the opposite side, then wait for the distraction to wear off before going in to rescue the statue. Samantha's nerves were frayed as they got closer to the camp. She could sense eyes on them, watching every step they made. They made it to the opposite side of the camp safely, and Jack promptly started the fire. The bandits leapt into action right away, dashing towards the flames to put them out. Samantha and her squad moved fast, remaining low and taking advantage of the diversion. They grabbed the statue and made a break for it. Samantha felt a sense of victory mixed with fear as they ran through the woods. The statue was theirs, but at what cost? She couldn't get rid of the sense that they were being watched, and that the curse was taking hold. They returned to their base camp and established a perimeter, knowing that the bandits would come hunting for them. They set traps and stood guard all night, but nothing occurred. Samantha attempted to persuade herself that it was all in her head, but she couldn't get rid of the sense that they were in danger. The next morning, they packed their belongings and began their trip back to civilization. Samantha was pleased to be leaving the forest, but she knew their problems weren't finished. Strange things began to happen to them as they journeyed. Their equipment began to fail, their maps became inaccurate, and their compasses began to spin erratically. It seemed as though the bush was attempting to stop them. Samantha realized they had to figure out how to break the curse before it was too late. They needed to discover the temple's mysteries and the symbols that decorated its walls. Samantha couldn't get the sensation that they were being followed as they returned to civilization. She couldn't explain it, but she felt their experience wasn't ended yet. Chapter 3: The Jungle Expedition. Dr. Samantha Gray and her team of researchers navigated the deep bush. The heat was suffocating, and the mosquitoes were unrelenting, yet they persisted, obsessed with finding the cursed gold statue. They'd been on the road for weeks, following hints and interpreting old manuscripts to get to their objective. The terrain got increasingly dangerous as they progressed deeper into the bush. The crew confronted hazardous fauna, high cliffs, and rushing rivers. Samantha, on the other hand, was adamant about continuing. She could see they were getting closer to their objective. They came across an old ruin one day while traveling through a dense bush. They had never seen anything like this temple before. The walls were ornately carved, and the air was dense with the aroma of incense. As Samantha entered the shrine, a shiver ran down her spine. She could feel them approaching closer to the statue. The group divided up and searched every nook and crevice of the shrine. Samantha was in a big chamber filled with golden items and odd inscriptions engraved into the walls. She approached a pedestal in the center of the room and found the cursed gold statue. Samantha's pulse raced as she grabbed for it. She felt a wave of electricity race through her body as her fingertips brushed over the surface of the statue. The curse was already in effect. The remainder of the crew around the monument, admiring its beauty. Samantha, on the other hand, understood they had to go before the curse claimed them as well. They gently pulled the statue from the temple and exited. The sky darkened as they exited from the temple, and a storm began to develop. Samantha knew they had to get out of the bush as soon as possible. Samantha noted that the other members of her squad were acting suspiciously as they made their way through the rain-soaked forest. They were aloof and silent, and their eyes glowed with an unearthly light. Samantha attempted to ignore the uneasy sensation that was creeping over her, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. She realized they had to figure out how to break the curse before it was too late. But how exactly? The crew encountered a number of difficulties as they continued on their quest. When their resources ran out, they were compelled to ration their food and water. They came upon hazardous beasts, and one of their crew members was severely hurt. Samantha refused to quit up despite these failures. She realized they had to find a means to break the spell. Samantha began to get bizarre images as they traveled deeper into the bush. She saw pictures of the goddess who had crafted the statue and heard murmurs in her ear pleading with her to retain the statue for herself. Samantha, on the other hand, understood she couldn't succumb to the curse. After what seemed like an age, they emerged from the woods, and Samantha realized they needed to act quickly. She assembled her team and proceeded to devise a strategy. They'd have to figure out how to break the curse before it was too late. Samantha felt she was the only one who could pull it off. Samantha started studying the monument seriously after the crew set up camp on the outskirts of the woods. She read old books, spoke with other archaeologists, and went into the depths of her own psyche. Finally, she discovered the solution. Returning the statue to the temple and offering a sacrifice was the only way to break the curse. Samantha knew it would be risky, but she was prepared to go to any length to remove the curse and save her crew. The return trip to the temple was much more perilous than the first. The forest appeared to be actively working against them, placing stumbling blocks in their path at every step. Yet Samantha and her crew persisted, knowing they were the only ones who could break the spell. Samantha understood what needed to be done when they got at the temple. She returned the statue to its pedestal with care and prepared to make the sacrifice. The rest of her crew stood there uncomfortably watching her make the offering, but when she was through, they all felt a weight lifted off their shoulders. The curse was broken. Samantha and her squad felt a feeling of relief and satisfaction as they made their way back to civilization. They had defied all odds and triumphed where so many others had failed. Yet they were also aware that they had gone perilously near to succumbing to the curse themselves. Samantha vowed to herself and her team that she would never again allow her fixation with ancient relics endanger them. They had been fortunate to have survived this time, but there was no promise that they would be so in the future. So they went back to their normal lives, appreciative for the experience but also pleased to be rid of the cursed gold statue and the jungle's perils. Chapter 4: The Discovery. Samantha and her team resumed their journey into the forest, searching for clues to the cursed gold statue. They were hot, sweaty, and stung by bugs, but their exhilaration rose with each step. They eventually arrived at a distant temple deep in the bush. Samantha's pulse pounded with excitement as they reached the temple. She could feel the statue's energy throbbing through the dense greenery and knew they were getting close. The group made their way through the temple's overgrown courtyard, which was covered with vines and fallen pillars. They could see the entrance to the inner room, which was guarded by a massive carved stone door. Samantha pulled on the door with quivering hands, and it groaned open with a loud moan. The crew entered the inner room, and their jaws fell at what they saw. The cursed gold statue glinted in the faint light in the center of the room. It was much more stunning than Samantha had expected, with elaborate carvings and glistening diamonds covering its surface. The squad was stunned for a time, but then they recalled the curse that came with the statue. They understood they had to act swiftly if they were to securely remove the statue from the shrine. Samantha inhaled deeply and approached the statue. A shiver raced down her spine as she stretched out to touch it. She could feel the curse creeping up on her. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and the temple walls began to rattle. The crew understood they had to leave the temple before it fell. They snatched the statue and dashed out of the inner room, tearing through the disintegrating temple as swiftly as they could. They sprawled on the ground outside, panting for oxygen. The temple had crumbled behind them, and they knew they had narrowly avoided death. Samantha gazed at the statue and realized they had to return it to civilization as soon as possible. She had a sense their adventure was far from complete, and the curse was only just getting started. Chapter 5: The Curse Takes Hold. Dr. Samantha Gray cautiously pulled the cursed gold statue from its resting place, a shiver running down her spine the moment she touched it. The air around her became thick and heavy, and she felt an odd sensation sweep over her. She hurriedly handed the statue to Jack, one of her team members, and attempted to remove the emotion from her body. But it did not go away. Instead, it became stronger as the crew returned through the deep forest. The sound of the trees rustling in the wind was foreboding, and the animals they passed appeared to look at them with uneasiness. Samantha had the impression that they were being watched, and the feeling got stronger as the day progressed. The squad set up camp for the night as the sun began to drop. Samantha couldn't escape the sensation that something wasn't right, and her concerns were heightened when she realized Jack had become aloof and silent. When they left the temple, he was the one carrying the statue, and she wondered whether he was suffering the effects of the curse as well. Samantha had a horrible nightmare that night. In her dream, she saw the goddess who had sculpted the statue standing before her in all her dreadful splendor. Samantha awoke in a chilly sweat, feeling as if the goddess was still looking at her. It only got worse the next day. One of the crew members became ill with an unknown fever, and their guide vanished without a trace. The trees seemed to grow closer together as they went farther into the forest, making it increasingly difficult to see where they were heading. Samantha knew they had to get out of the jungle before the curse entirely overtook them. They heard weird whispering in the wind as they trudged through the deep foliage, and the animals around them began to act strangely. The birds stopped chirping, and the monkeys became hushed, as if they sensed something bad was going to happen. Samantha felt a wave of relief rush over her when they came into a clearing. They'd gotten it out of the forest and were almost home. Yet, when she turned to notify the others, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Jack had vanished. They explored the area but found no trace of him. Samantha saw a sense of sadness flood over her as she realized the curse had finally taken hold of him. They had traveled so far just to lose one of their number to the curse of the cursed gold statue. Samantha understood that they had to keep going no matter what. She needed to find a method to remove the curse before any more lives were lost. Samantha felt the weight of the curse on her shoulders as they headed off again, and she knew their trip was far from complete. Chapter 6: The Vision. Dr. Samantha Gray rested in her tent, attempting to sleep after a hard day of trekking through the deep forest. A startling noise startled her to sleep. It sounded like leaves rustling, but she could sense something more in the darkness with her. Samantha reached for her flashlight and pointed it at the door to her tent. She noticed a man standing outside, lighted by the moonlight. The figure was tall, with long hair that flew in the breeze and a gorgeous and terrible face. Samantha suddenly knew that the cursed gold statue was the work of the goddess. Samantha attempted to scream, but her voice became stuck in her throat. The goddess spoke to her in a soothing yet dangerous tone, asking her to abandon her quest of the cursed gold statue. Samantha knew she couldn't disregard the warning, but her attachment to the relic was too strong. The goddess then vanished, leaving Samantha terrified. Samantha was troubled by the image for the rest of the night, and she knew it was a warning. She couldn't keep putting herself and her crew in danger because of her infatuation with the cursed gold statue. She realized they had to break the curse and find a means to break free from the artifact's grip. Samantha decided to do whatever it needed to remove the curse of the cursed gold statue and guarantee that her crew got it out alive as she watched the sunrise over the jungle. Chapter 7: The Deaths Begin. The curse takes its first victim, and the protagonist understands that his family is in peril. Samantha resumed her usual life, but something didn't feel right. She couldn't get rid of the impression that the curse of the gold statue was still hovering over her. She thought she had broken the curse by returning the statue to its rightful location, but she was mistaken. The curse had just recently begun. It all started with the loss of one of her expedition companions, Jack. Samantha received a phone call from his wife, who was inconsolable, informing her that Jack had died in his sleep. Samantha's mind raced with ideas of the curse, knowing it couldn't be a coincidence. She remembered the weird forest noises and whispers, the sense of being pursued, and the nightmares. She realized she needed to alert the others. Samantha phoned the remaining expedition members, who all agreed to meet to examine the matter. They recognized when they assembled that they had all had unusual experiences since the voyage. One had been in a vehicle accident, while the other had been sick for weeks. They were all aware that they were the curse's target. They were talking when they realized that their phones had no service and that the power in the building was flickering. They heard a loud disturbance outside and noticed a person standing in the shadows as they peeked out the window. Samantha knew the apparition from her dreams as the goddess. Samantha and her colleagues were scared and realized they had to act quickly to remove the curse before more lives were lost. They agreed to part ways in order to discover a solution to break the curse. When Samantha went to the library to learn more about the goddess and the curse, the others looked for any hints that may help them break the spell. Samantha realized that the curse was tied to the goddess who crafted the statue as she studied. The statue had been cursed by the goddess to punish people who were greedy and selfish. Samantha recognized that a sacrifice was required to please the goddess and break the spell. The gang reassembled and returned to the temple where they had discovered the cursed gold statue. They gathered around the pedestal and offered the goddess a sacrifice. They felt a huge weight lifted off their shoulders, and they knew the spell had been broken. Samantha recognized they were fortunate to have survived as they went out of the temple. She understood they needed to be more cautious in the future and urged her squad to avoid any cursed objects. They'd discovered their lesson the hard way. Chapter 8: The Pursuit. Samantha and her crew had overcome the spell of the cursed gold statue, but they were still in danger. The news of their finding had reached the ears of others who were eager to go to any length to obtain the statue. Samantha received a phone call from her colleague, Dr. Jameson, warning her that a crew of unscrupulous businesspeople was on its way to her institution in search of the cursed gold statue. Samantha was well aware that they would go to any length to obtain the statue and that they needed to act quickly. Samantha and her crew packed their belongings and started off on a quest to protect the monument. They traveled by ferry, rail, and vehicle, following back routes and remaining hidden. They could feel eyes on them and a sensation that they were being followed as they walked. They eventually landed in a little village in the highlands and decided to hide the statue in an abandoned mine. They erected traps and stood guard, but they knew they couldn't remain forever. Samantha sought the assistance of a colleague who specialized in curses. They were standing guard one night when they heard footsteps approaching the mine. Samantha and her squad prepared to defend the monument with their lives. The party of merchants stormed the mine, only to be met by a barrage of traps and gunshots. The battle was fierce, but Samantha and her squad triumphed. They realized they couldn't allow the monument get into the hands of the wrong people, so they made the painful choice to destroy it. They shattered the cursed gold statue to pieces and dispersed the shards in the wind, their hearts sorrowful. Samantha and her colleagues were fatigued yet relieved when they arrived home. They knew they'd made the correct decision, but they couldn't escape the sensation that something was still waiting for them out there. They swore to remain alert and never again allow their infatuation with ancient relics put them in peril. Chapter 9: The Betrayal. Dr. Samantha Gray and her team had been working for months to break the spell of the cursed gold statue and were finally making headway. They'd been gathering supplies and preparing to bring the statue to the temple to remove the spell, but something wasn't quite right. Samantha couldn't put her finger on it, but she had the impression that they were being observed. Samantha was getting supplies in town one day when she saw one of her team members, Lucas, acting strangely. He was making phone calls and appeared to be keeping his distance from the rest of the crew. Samantha confronted him, but he dismissed her and stated he was only taking care of some personal matters. Samantha attempted to shake her uneasy sensation, but it just became stronger. She discovered the statue was missing when she returned to their base camp. Samantha became terrified when she discovered that someone on her team had taken the statue. She instantly assembled her squad to discover out who had taken it. Everyone denied knowing anything, but Lucas appeared especially apprehensive. When Samantha suspected him, he adamantly denied it and even volunteered to assist in the search for the statue. Samantha realized she couldn't trust him and kept a tight eye on him. She noticed him slipping away from camp one night and pursued him. He took her to a tiny town and handed over the statue to a group of guys. Samantha was stunned and enraged. She approached Lucas, who ultimately acknowledged that he had been bribed by a rival archaeologist to take the statue. He expected to take the statue and sell it for a significant sum of money, but he misjudged Samantha and her crew. Samantha was devastated that one of her team members had betrayed her, but she knew she couldn't allow it derail their goal. She planned a strategy to reclaim the statue and addressed the opposing archaeologist. Samantha and her squad were able to rescue the statue and return it to the temple after a tough battle. Samantha felt a sense of relief and satisfaction as the spell was finally lifted. Samantha felt grateful for her team and the adventures they had shared despite the treachery. She knew they'd all grown and learned from the experience, and she was proud of what they'd done. She vowed to remain ever cautious and to never let her guard down again. Chapter 10: The Truth Behind the Curse. The protagonist learns the truth behind the curse and understands the goddess is a vindictive entity. Dr. Samantha Gray and her team had broken the spell of the cursed gold statue, but Samantha suspected there was more to the story. She needed to figure out who made the statue and why. She read old manuscripts, examined relics, and chatted with locals, but nothing made sense. Eventually, she came upon a scroll that told the narrative of the goddess who had sculpted the statue. It told of a malevolent creature who cursed the statue in order to punish people who attempted to take it. Samantha was taken aback. She'd always believed in the power of old relics, but she'd never met a being capable of cursing a statue. She realized they had to do something to placate the goddess and end the curse once and for all. She assembled her crew and went to the temple where the statue was made. As they arrived, they saw a modest altar with offerings strewn about it. Samantha understood exactly what she had to do. She approached the goddess and apologized for her team's behavior before presenting a sacrifice. Samantha felt a chill go down her spine as the air became heavier. The statue suddenly began to shine, and a tremendous crack resonated throughout the temple. Samantha and her crew stood in astonishment as the statue shattered into 1,000 pieces, breaking the spell. Samantha recognized that her preoccupation with the cursed gold statue had killed many of her team members, and that the goddess was not to be trifled with. She vowed never to let her love of ancient relics put her or her crew in jeopardy again. Samantha couldn't help but wonder what other mysteries lie buried in the world's old ruins, and what beings awaited those who attempted to explore them as they made their way back to civilization. Chapter 11: The Final Showdown. Dr. Samantha Gray faced the goddess, her heart pounding. She'd traveled too far to turn back now, but she couldn't shake the terror that was rushing through her veins. Her eyes flashed with strength and hatred as the goddess towered over her. "You should have heeded my warning," the goddess murmured, her voice booming across the room. "I couldn't let the curse damage people any longer," Samantha answered, her voice firm despite her dread. The goddess chuckled. "Despite this, you felt you could shatter it. You humans are so stupid." As the goddess lifted her hand, a ball of fire formed in her palm. Samantha took a step back. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the blow, but when she opened them again, the goddess was vanished. Samantha staggered back, startled, realizing she was alone in the chamber. She looked around, attempting to comprehend what had just occurred. She knew she had discovered something old and powerful since the area was packed with weird symbols and objects. But she also knew she had to get away before the goddess returned. She heard murmurs and weird sounds as she moved across the chamber, and she knew the curse was still present. Yet she would not give up. She'd come too far to give up now. She crept into the short tunnel leading out of the room, scratching her knees on the hard stone. She found herself in a different area of the temple as she emerged, and she realized she was getting closer to the exit. But as she walked through the temple, she sensed a presence behind her and turned to see the goddess standing there, her eyes red with rage. "You can't get away from me," the goddess shouted, her voice resonating throughout the temple. Samantha inhaled deeply and concentrated her energies. She realized she had to find a method to finally vanquish the goddess. She closed her eyes and chanted, summoning the power of the ancient objects that surrounded her. She opened her eyes again to see the chamber flooded with light and the goddess screaming in anguish. Samantha knew she had discovered and broken the curse's source. Samantha dropped on the ground, tired yet glad, as the goddess departed. She knew that by breaking the curse, she had saved numerous lives, and she felt a sense of joy and success that she had never felt before. She knew as she walked out of the temple that she would never forget the things she had gained on her voyage. She had been confronted with the power of old relics and had learned to appreciate it. She had also learned the value of tenacity and bravery in the face of great peril. She knew her life would never be the same again as she stepped out into the brilliant sunlight. Chapter 12: The Sacrifice. The crew prepares for the sacrifice that will break the curse. Samantha and her crew returned to the temple where they had discovered the cursed gold statue. The crew had discussed the strategy to break the curse, and they understood what they had to do. Samantha directed her staff to gather supplies and prepare for the sacrifice. To release the curse, they needed to donate something valuable to the goddess who crafted the statue. Samantha felt uneasy as they prepared. She questioned if they were doing the right thing by sacrificing something valuable to break the spell. Yet she realized the curse was too deadly to continue, and the sacrifice was the only way to break it. Samantha led the crew to the monument and began the ritual. She repeated an old prayer, and the crew joined in. Samantha pulled out a knife and made a little incision on her palm. She let the blood run onto the statue, giving it to the goddess. Samantha felt a stinging pain in her chest when she performed this. She gulped for oxygen and collapsed on the ground. The squad raced to her aid, but she was unconscious. They were horrified, believing that the sacrifice had gone awry and that Samantha had died as a result of the curse. But then they saw a tiny glimmer emerging from the statue. The spell was breaking. The team stood there in awe as the monument began to crumble into dust. Samantha sat up, feeling weak yet alive. The curse had been removed. Samantha and her crew felt a feeling of relaxation and success. They had broken the curse, and they were no longer bound by it. They realized they were lucky to have survived the ordeal, and they determined never to allow their fixation with ancient relics put them in danger again. Samantha felt a feeling of closure as they exited the temple. She had accomplished her goal and saved lives in the process. She knew she would always be tormented by the curse of the cursed gold statue, but she also knew she had the strength to confront any obstacle that lied ahead. Chapter 13: The Return. The protagonist restores the monument to its proper location, but at what cost? Samantha and her crew have finally broken the spell of the cursed gold statue by restoring it to its rightful position in the temple, and sacrificing. But the return trip was not without incident. Strange things began to happen as they made their way back to civilization. The members of the squad were ill, and the fauna surrounding them appeared to become more aggressive. Samantha was certain that the curse had not been completely removed and that they needed to act immediately to protect themselves. Samantha returned the statue to the museum where it belonged when the team returned home. Yet as soon as she did, a peculiar sensation washed over her. The curse had not been completely broken. She knew she had to return to the temple to identify the actual root of the curse and eliminate it once and for all. Samantha assembled a fresh squad and embarked on a new mission to the temple. They had more difficulties this time, as the forest appeared to be resisting their presence. They faced hostile creatures and perilous terrain, yet they persisted. As they returned to the temple, Samantha got a sensation of déjà vu. She noted that the markings on the walls seemed to be throbbing with an alien force as they made their way to the inner room. As they arrived to the pedestal where the statue had been, it was empty. Samantha became aware of a presence behind her. She turned around to find the statue's creator, the goddess, standing before her. Samantha's homecoming enraged the goddess, who wanted to know why she had returned. Samantha claimed that she had come to finally put an end to the curse. Samantha was instructed by the goddess that the curse could only be broken if she gave up something she loved. Samantha understood that the team's previous sacrifice had not been sufficient. She understood exactly what she had to do. Samantha made the ultimate sacrifice by giving her life to end the curse. The offering was accepted by the goddess, and the curse was lifted. Samantha's crew was able to safely exit the temple, but they had to leave behind a hero who had given her life to save them. Samantha's sacrifice swiftly spread, and her story became legend. Her legacy was preserved when the museum constructed a statue in her honor. Her teammates recalled her as a courageous and selfless leader who had sacrificed everything to save them. The cursed gold statue was never found, and the temple was abandoned. Samantha's quest had gone full circle, and her sacrifice had ended a curse that had plagued her for so long. Chapter 14: The Aftermath. The curse has been broken, but the consequences are disastrous. The spell of the cursed gold statue has finally been broken by Dr. Samantha Gray and her crew. The curse was lifted once they returned it to the temple and made the sacrifice. Yet, The consequences of their mission were disastrous. Samantha and her gang had barely survived the forest. They'd lost a number of team members, including Jack, who had vanished without a trace. They were injured and abused, both physically and mentally. The mission had taken its toll on them all, and they realized they would never be able to resume their usual lives as if nothing had occurred. Samantha and her squad were met with mistrust and doubt when they returned to civilization. Nobody believed their tale of the cursed gold statue and the goddess who made it. They were accused of being con artists and seeking publicity. Samantha attempted to convince anybody who would listen that she was telling the truth, but no one believed her. Samantha's fixation with locating the cursed gold statue has cost her much more than she had anticipated. She'd lost her friends, her reputation, and her sanity. Her fixation with ancient relics had blinded her to the hazards of her mission, she realized. Samantha and her crew struggled to acclimatize to their new reality in the weeks that followed their return. They were plagued by nightmares, anxiety, and sadness. They all blamed themselves for what had transpired and for not paying attention to the natives' warnings. Samantha realized she needed to make atonement for what had occurred. She offered her skills to unearth historical sites and teach people in archaeological procedures to aid the local populations. She believed that by doing so, she would be able to make amends for her actions and prevent others from making the same mistake. Samantha and her crew gradually began to recover as time passed. They began to accept what had occurred and learnt to forgive themselves. They knew they'd never forget the horrors they'd witnessed, but they also understood they could use their knowledge to aid others. Samantha knew she needed to adapt her approach to her career. She had to proceed with caution and respect for the customs and traditions of the people she was researching. She was aware that the past may provide insight into the present, but she was also aware that it could be harmful. The enchantment of the cursed gold statue had been broken, but Samantha and her crew had been crushed by the repercussions of their mission. They'd learned an important lesson about the perils of fixation and the value of remembering the past. They had paid a high price for their quest, but they had also learned a deeper appreciation for life's fragility and the significance of living in the now.